This is Porter Block. I'm a New York-based musician, and I also am a huge music fan.
Let's begin.
This podcast explores music from every angle, and I'll be talking to people who've made the business of music the focus of their life. Welcome to In a State. Laila Biali is a gifted piano player, singer, and composer from Canada.
Born in Brooklyn in 49, lived on Lincoln all this time.
She's lent her voice and toured with the likes Chris Bodie, Sting, Diana Krall, Paula Cole, and Suzanne Vega. What's so striking about Laila, aside from her obvious talent and her God-gifted voice, is her complete lack of pretense in what she does so effortlessly. She melds pop music with traditional jazz, a song interpreter of the first order, pulling pop songs, well-known ones, through her tightly woven, piano-driven jazz combo. I sat down with Laila early the next morning in her hotel after her triumphant gig. When I sat down with Laila, I wanted to know a little bit more detail about a childhood accident that occurred, a car accident which disabled her arm and upended her career as a classical pianist. Fortuitously, it gave her the opportunity to explore jazz and her voice as another artistic outlet.
At the time, it was one of the hardest things I'd ever been through. But
how old were you when it happened?
I was 15.
There was a teacher who kind of got you through it. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, yeah, he didn't get me through it necessarily, but what he did was he presented an alternative pathway. The accident was that summer, and then I was moving schools. So I moved from, my middle school to this other school, secondary school, and they had a really great jazz program. And I think he saw an opportunity, like, well, you can continue to play with your left hand. And he got me into percussion. And I did not yet really explore singing. It really wasn't until I went to college. But that one event did lead to, explorations as a composer, as an arranger, certainly as a vocalist. And as you mentioned, the discovery of jazz as a genre.
Joni Mitchell obviously is an artist that you have an affinity for, and she was an early genre blender as a songwriter and as a pop cultural icon.
Yeah.
You still play you cover Woodstock beautifully, and you did it last night.
Yeah. Her love of jazz is evident in her, recorded works and like when she was working with Brecker and Jaco Pastorius and even her nod to Mingus, right? Mingus. Jazz is in the DNA of her songs. And so even though her recordings are guitar driven, it just was such a natural extension to take her more basic harmony and kind of open it up at the piano. And so I would say of all the artists I've covered, the connection to jazz with her music was the most organic.
And we've got to get ourselves back to the garden.
Songs like Yellow, for instance, which you cover, are so well suited. Just the jazz approach to it gives it a completely different, you're in between things when you're playing Yellow.
I think Coldplay, it's just straight ahead. They're sophisticated musicians and, there's some interesting tensions in their version. The seven you mentioned is sort of very defining of within the jazz idiom. And And so I'm quite certain it's not in the original Coldplay, and that was the sort of my little stamp, like, okay, we're taking this into different territory.
Look at the stars, look how they shine for you, and everything you do. Yeah, they were all yellow. I came along, I wrote a song for you, and all the things you do, and it was called Yellow.
Any pushback, like for instance, from either the jazz crowd or the pop crowd that you're, kind of going both ways?
Well, it sort of dawned on me that it is the tradition, within the tradition of jazz, to cover pop songs, because songs from the Great American Songbook were at one point the popular songs of their day. And it was like a revelation to me, because I'm not the only jazz musician right now, taking songs by more contemporary artists like Radiohead, Bjork, etc. In fact, one of the first concerts that I ever saw, this is like 15 years ago, that really made an impression was Jeffrey Keyser, a wonderful jazz pianist. He was in Toronto, and I had never heard anyone cover music by Radiohead and Bjork. Incredible. And then I learned later that Cassandra Wilson had been covering more contemporary music for a while, and it was nothing particularly new. But yes, it's like that is actually the spirit of jazz, is to take songs that are already templated, have been written, and they're out there. And I know with the Great American Songbook, more people have within jazz. I mean, that is like the jazz songbook in a way. But I think it's within the tradition of jazz to specifically take those songs and not just cover them, but to really take them into new territory, to bring them into, especially harmonically speaking. And I have gotten some flack, so not within the jazz community, but actually from die-hard fans of the artists I'm covering.
Of course.
So they see that material as sacred. And it's like, why? Why would you take this perfect music and sort of, and dirty it up with your jazz chords? And I think they probably feel that I've moved away from the spirit of the song.
Look at the stars, look how they shine for you, and all the things you
Refugee. I was like, oh great, she's covering Tom Petty. And then I see you actually wrote an incredible song about present day times and some of the struggles. Talk about that song in particular.
Yeah, so I take in my news via the BBC Global News podcast, and so I had heard a really harrowing report on a bombing in Syria. They allowed us to hear, the aftermath of the bombing. It was quite horrible. They described a 5-year-old boy who had sustained major head injuries. And Joshua, my son, was 5 at the time. And I was sick over it. And you're listening to this news, comfortable, and I was actually at a friend's house at the time, staying with a friend in Oakville. I must have had a show or something in Toronto. Just there in my privileged life, and I hear this report, and what could I do to impact things? I felt very powerless, helpless, and it just was a very natural response to go to the piano and through tears write a song, and that's what I did, and that was the beginning of the song Refugee.
Satellite, which you covered last night
Yeah.
live, is about personal issues. I mean, so you're taking what's going on in your world, both personally and outside, and trying to somehow interpret it through your music. Talk about Satellite a little bit.
Yeah, Satellite is a love letter to my son and husband. I, at the time, and I still am, was touring a fair bit away from them. I try to bring them with me whenever I can, but just logistically, we have had to, as I call it, divide and conquer a fair bit. And so I was playing a show in Niagara-on-the-Lake and really longing for them to be with me to share in the experience, especially after the show. And they couldn't be there, and it was too late to call them. I couldn't even have that touch point. And so I kind of imagined, willed them into the car with me using my imagination. And then that song came to mind, this idea of trying to make contact with loved ones who are far away through our own memories, and how we can conceive of them in our mind. So that's what that song is all about.
I guess your first record of new material was a record called House of Many Rooms. And there's a song on that, but Little Bird is a pretty tough little song.
That's the sister song for Satellite.
Yeah.
You nailed it. Yeah, well, so Little Bird is another, also a love letter to both my husband and son, but it takes me back to a time when, Ben and I got pregnant and we were not yet married, and we in fact weren't even together when I found out that I was with child. And it was really complex. We had a very complex relationship, very fraught. And in a way, Josh was a rival, and not, the recognition and discovery that I was pregnant with Josh led to us really getting serious about how we actually felt about one another. All everything that had sort of been pulling us apart became secondary, and really I was able to finally strip all of that away and see the very pure love that we had for one another, as cheesy as that sounds. And so that song talks about how, in a way, when it was Josh. I don't really believe in this concept of one person that you're destined to be with. We talk about the one. I really think that we pave a way forward together. We make choices along the way, and you yourselves determine if you want to be together and make it work. It sounds kind of unromantic.
No, I think it's
very pragmatic.
I think it's pretty practical.
Yeah.
You used this expression once. I think your husband came up with it, that he gave you the strength to break out of the jazz box. And that's what I meant by orthodoxy. And here you're coming out with a pretty strong, radio-friendly piece of music. That's a big step for you, right?
Yeah, it was. And in a way, the reason the new album is self-titled is because it feels like finally all the various threads from music I've explored and arranged and created and written over the years are coming together on the new album. And finally coexisting happily. And Got to Love, in a way, was my way of preserving more of a pop edge, which was really present on House of Many Rooms. But what House of Many Rooms, the last album, did, it didn't neglect my jazz roots, but it really moved away from them. And almost too much, especially as a jazz musician. The songs that you write and record really develop a personality as you take them out on the road and showcase them live, and you discover new things about them.
You did a live record, which is something that I love. I think is a lost art form.
That came about. We didn't even intend to make a live record when we performed that night, but it was in the CBC building, and they recorded us because that's what they do. And then my manager at the time, she said, it's really hard to capture what you actually sound like in the studio. And again, we've talked a lot about the spirit of jazz, but it's like that energy that you get when there's an audience responding and interacting with the musicians, it impacts the sound. There's no doubt about it. And while it tends to often be more flawed and less produced, there is an energy to it that you really don't often find in the studio, unless you go back to the old days where people were live off the floor. And I think that's actually why Snarky Puppy, to reference them again, when they make their records, they bring in an audience and set them up around the band in this circle. And they're all under headphones, so it's a combination of, top-level production, in-studio production, but then there's a bit of that energy of having people to kind of respond to as you're seeing them respond to the music, and it goes both ways, and it's this beautiful interaction.
Are you pursuing co-writing? Are you looking to work with other songwriters?
It's funny you should mention that, because on the new record, we actually cut 21 songs in the studio, and many of which were co-writes. I had co-written a song with Royal Wood. Ron Sexsmith had begun to take on a song that existed in a previous form, and I wanted him to write lyrics because he's just so brilliant. And I'd co-written with a French singer in Montreal, Sonia Johnson, and also Mark Jordan. And none of those songs made it on to this record, only because they didn't fit, not because they weren't good enough, or they didn't feel like they were cohesive with the rest. And so I have this body of work already that I'm revisiting now, but I'm just, the road is really where ideas take shape. And I had a 7-hour drive with stops between Columbus, Ohio, and London, Ontario, and that was when I really started to hatch plans for the next record, which you have to begin doing that sort of thing when the current release is in its cycle of being, put out there and performed and toured. You have to already be thinking ahead to the next record. Yeah.
Is this a tour? Or are you just sort of doing mercenary hits in major cities, or how are you approaching the live
I love
thing?
it. There's nothing I love more than touring. And so this has been quite an extensive tour, 36 dates, and then I'm going to be in Europe for 3.5 weeks. We have some rules, Ben and I, my husband and I. Neither one of us should be away from Josh for more than 2 weeks at a time.
Is it any different for you playing a small room, a storied room like Birdland, and then you also play these giant festivals? I know you've gone to Japan, you've played other much larger audiences, and you're in a very small combo. What's that like?
I love both, and I mean, there is something about the immediacy of the room and the audience when you're in a smaller venue, but it's funny when they're eating dinner. A song like Refugee, I think, oh gosh, is that too heavy? These people are here just enjoying dinner. Do they want dinner jazz? Because they're not going to get it. And I worry sometimes, as people were picking up their coats at the end of the night yesterday, actually, at Birdland. It kind of, you wonder, was it too heavy? It is another platform when you're at an outdoor festival or in a proper performance venue, like a soft seat theater. People come and they're there to listen to the music, and that is all. That's the experience holistically. Whereas at Birdland, you get tourists, you get people jazz tourists, and they go there and they want to have a nice meal and just take in some jazz. But I know that my music, for better or worse, is kind of demanding. And so while we've been touring across North America, and actually the U.S. in particular, this new record, we've been in a lot of supper clubs. And I actually have asked my band for their opinion.
Change the set a little or not?
Well, I haven't really, but I have asked my band, is Refugee too heavy to be serving up as people are, having the lobster bisque? Or what, is it going to give them indigestion? Is it too much, And I mean, really, I actually am not saying that just tongue in cheek. I've wondered if it's too intense. It's not.
If you go
dark.
down a dark hole for a song or two,
yeah,
I think everyone knows it's going to pick up, and it did with the crew you had last night. Yeah. This is amazing. So I have.
Thank you for having me.
I want to thank Laila and Surefire Entertainment for allowing me to see the show and giving me the opportunity to talk to her about her music and her life and what she does. My name is Porter Block. You can hear my music on Spotify or iTunes or any streaming service. I want to thank you, the audience, for listening. We take a lot of time and care in putting these things together, and we hope you enjoy. So remember, if you're listening to this, you're in a state.
In a state.